Ruth Callahan heard the soft whimpering before she saw the blood, drops of crimson leading from her broken fence gate to her front porch, where a small Apache girl knelt in the dust, cradling something precious against her chest. Tears cutting, clean tracks through the dirt on her face as she looked up with eyes that held more sorrow than any child should ever carry. The Arizona Territory sun had barely crested the red mesa when Ruth first spotted the tracks. She'd been checking her property line, looking for where the coyotes had been getting through to worry her chickens, when she noticed footprints too small to belong to any of the ranch hands from neighboring spreads. Child's tracks, bare feet, pressing into the hard-packed earth with the desperate urgency of someone running from something terrible. Ruth Callahan had lived alone on her homestead for 3 years now, ever since cholera took her husband Patrick during the hard winter of 1883. The isolation hadn't bothered her much at first. After bearing 2 babies who never drew breath and watching Patrick waste away despite all her nursing, solitude felt like mercy rather than punishment. But lately, the silence had begun to feel heavier, like something pressing against her chest. In the long hours between sunset and dawn, she followed the tracks back toward her cabin, noting how they meandered at first, then grew more focused, more determined. Whoever had made them knew exactly where they were heading. The prints led straight to her water well, where Ruth could see the disturbed dust around the wooden bucket. Someone had drawn water here in the darkness, probably sometime before the morning dew. The whimpering sound came again, soft and pained, like an injured animal trying not to attract attention. Ruth's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver Patrick had taught her to use, though something about the sound made her think this wasn't a threat that bullets could solve. She rounded the corner of her cabin and stopped dead in her tracks. Young Apache girl, no more than 10 or 11 years old, knelt on Ruth's front porch. Her doe-skin dress was torn and stained with travel, her long black hair tangled with burrs and desert thorns. But it was what she held in her arms that made Ruth's breath catch. A cottontail rabbit, its hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle, its soft grey fur matted with blood. The girl looked up at Ruth's approach, and the rawness in her dark eyes hit like a physical blow. This child had seen things no young person should witness. Loss lived in those eyes, the kind of profound grief that aged a soul beyond its years. "Please," the girl whispered in accented English, her voice barely audible. "He is dying, and I do not know how to save him." Ruth stood frozen, part of her mind cataloguing all the reasons why this was dangerous. Apache raids had been frequent in recent months, with tensions running high between the territorial government and the various bands who refused to accept reservation life. Helping this child could mean trouble with the cavalry, or worse, could be some kind of trap. But then the rabbit made a soft sound of distress, and the girl's lower lip began to tremble as she looked down at the injured creature. Ruth had raised enough animals to recognize when something was suffering, and the protective way the child cradled the rabbit spoke of genuine care, not deception. "What happened to him?" Ruth asked, her voice gentler than she'd intended. The girl's eyes filled with fresh tears. "The metal teeth," she said, struggling with words that clearly weren't her first language. "The traps your people put in the ground. He was trying to find food, and the metal teeth caught his leg." Ruth felt a stab of guilt. She knew about the steel traps scattered throughout the territory by ranchers trying to protect their livestock from predators. She'd never set any herself, but she'd seen the damage they could do to any creature unlucky enough to trigger them. "Let me see," Ruth said, setting aside her caution and kneeling beside the girl. The rabbit was indeed badly injured, its hind leg clearly broken, possibly beyond saving. But the animal was still alert, its dark eyes bright with pain, but not yet glazed with approaching death. The girl watched Ruth's examination with desperate hope. You can help him. The women in my village said there was a healing woman who lived alone by the red rocks. They said she had magic in her hands, that she could mend what was broken. Ruth almost laughed at the description. Magic hands. If only healing were that simple. She'd tried magic when the babies came too early, tried prayer and hope and every folk remedy the other ranch wives could suggest. None of it had mattered in the end. But this rabbit wasn't her lost children, and this desperate girl wasn't, asking for miracles, just for someone to try. Ruth had splintered broken bones before, in chickens and goats, and once in a neighbor's dog. The rabbit's injury was severe, but not necessarily fatal if treated properly. I can try, Ruth said carefully, but I need to know your name, child, and I need to understand why you're alone out here. The girl hesitated, as if names were dangerous things to share with strangers. Finally she whispered, Kiona. My name is Kiona. Well, Kiona, I'm Ruth Callahan, and if we're going to save this rabbit, we need to work quickly. Can you carry him inside without jostling that leg too much? Kiona nodded eagerly, rising to her feet with careful movements that spoke of experience handling injured creatures. Ruth led her into the cabin, noting how the girl's eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust impermanence. Ruth's cabin was modest but well-maintained. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with shelves above it holding her small collection of books and Patrick's carved wooden cross. A table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the single room, with Ruth's bed tucked into one corner and her cooking area arranged along the opposite wall. Everything was clean and orderly, the kind of space that reflected someone who found comfort in having control over small things. Set him on the table, Ruth instructed, clearing away her breakfast dishes to make room. Gently now. As Kiona carefully placed the rabbit on the wooden surface, Ruth gathered her supplies. She had experience with veterinary care from years of ranch life, and her medicine kit contained splinting materials, laudanum for pain, and clean bandages. The rabbit would need all of these and more if it was going to survive. Talk to him, Ruth said, as she began examining the break more thoroughly. Animals respond to familiar voices. It helps keep them calm. Kiona immediately began speaking, in what Ruth assumed was Apache, her voice taking on a crooning musical quality that seemed to soothe the injured rabbit. The animal's rapid breathing slowed slightly, though its eyes remained wide with pain and fear. Ruth worked with practiced efficiency, her hands moving with the confidence that came from years of necessity. Ranch life taught you to be self-reliant in matters of injury and illness, whether the patient walked on 2 legs or 4. She delivered calves, treated infected wounds, and set more broken bones than she cared to count. But there was something different about working with this particular patient while Kiona watched. The girl's absolute focus, her obvious love for the small creature, reminded Ruth of things she'd tried to forget. The tenderness she'd once felt for fragile things, before life taught her that loving something small and helpless was usually just a prelude to heartbreak. The bone is displaced, but not shattered, Ruth said as she worked. If we can set it properly and keep him still while it heals, he has a good chance. Kiona's eyes lit with hope. He will run again? Maybe, Ruth said honestly. Animals are tougher than people sometimes think. They want to live, and they don't give up easily. As she splinted the rabbit's leg with careful precision, Ruth found herself stealing glances at Kiona. The girl was clearly exhausted, probably hungry, and definitely alone in ways that went beyond simply being separated from family. There was something about her careful stillness, the way she flinched slightly when Ruth moved too quickly, that spoke of recent trauma. Kiona, Ruth said gently as she wrapped the splint in place. When did you last eat a proper meal? The girl's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, answering the question before she could speak. She flushed with embarrassment, but Ruth pretended not to notice. I have beans and cornbread from yesterday, and I was about to make coffee, Ruth continued. The rabbit needs to rest anyway, and you look like you could use some food and maybe a chance to clean up. Kiona's eyes filled with tears again, but these seemed different from the earlier ones. Relief, maybe, or simply gratitude that someone had offered basic kindness without asking for explanations she might not be ready to give. I have nothing to trade, Kiona said quietly. No money, no goods. I cannot pay for food or for helping him. Ruth felt her chest tighten. How many times had this child been turned away, been told that help came with a price she couldn't afford? The thought of it made Ruth angry in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Did I ask for payment? Ruth said firmly. A creature is hurt, and you brought him to someone who might be able to help. That's how decent folks behave toward each other, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Kiona stared at her with something like wonder, as if kindness without strings attached was a foreign concept. Ruth busied herself with heating the beans and slicing cornbread, giving the girl time to process this unexpected generosity. As they ate together in companionable silence, Ruth found herself studying Kiona more carefully. The girl had good manners, eating slowly and neatly despite obvious hunger. Her English, while accented, was clear and grammatically correct. Someone had taken time to educate her, to teach her how to interact with white settlers. Where did you learn English? Ruth asked. The mission school, Kiona replied between careful bites. Before the soldiers came and everything changed, Ruth knew about the mission schools, where Apache children were sent to learn white ways and forget their own culture. She'd always had mixed feelings about the practice, understanding the practical necessity while questioning the humanity of it. How long were you there? Ruth continued. 3 summers, Kiona said. Long enough to learn reading and numbers and the Jesus songs, but not long enough to forget who I really am. There was defiance in that last statement, a quiet pride that Ruth couldn't help but admire. This girl had survived forced assimilation while holding on to her identity, which spoke of remarkable strength for someone so young. And your family? Ruth asked gently. Kiona's face closed off immediately, pain flickering across, her features like shadow passing over sunlit ground. Gone, she said simply. All gone. Ruth didn't push. She recognized the look of someone protecting a wound too fresh and deep for casual discussion. Instead, she refilled Kiona's cup with water and checked on the rabbit, who seemed to be resting more comfortably now that the pain medication was taking effect. He's stronger than he looks, Ruth observed. Wild things usually are. Kiona nodded, reaching out to gently stroke the rabbit's ears. His name is Chua. It means friend in my language. I found him when he was very small, after something killed his mother. I thought maybe we could take care of each other. The simple statement hit Ruth harder than she'd expected. Here was a child who had lost everything, yet still had enough compassion to rescue and care for an orphaned animal. The parallel between Kiona and Chua wasn't lost on Ruth. 2 creatures without families, finding solace in each other's company. You've done a good job taking care of him, Ruth said. He trusts you completely. Animals know when you mean them no harm, Kiona replied. People are harder to understand sometimes. Ruth couldn't argue with that observation. People were indeed complicated, capable of cruelty disguised as kindness, and kindness that came with hidden costs. Animals, by contrast, were refreshingly straightforward in their needs and responses. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Ruth realized she faced a decision that would affect more than just the next few hours. Kiona clearly had nowhere to go, no family to return to, no safe place to rest while her rabbit companion healed. The decent thing would be to offer shelter, at least temporarily. But decent and safe weren't always the same thing. Harboring an Apache child, even one who seemed harmless, could bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities or angry neighbors. Ruth had worked too hard to build her independent life to risk it lightly. Yet as she watched Kiona carefully adjust Chua's position to make him more comfortable, Ruth found her practical concerns fading. This child had already lost so much. Could Ruth really add one more rejection to that burden? "Kiona," Ruth said finally, "the rabbit is going to need several days to stabilize before we know if the leg will heal properly. You're welcome to stay here while he recovers." The girl's eyes went wide with disbelief. "You would let me stay, even though I am Apache?" "You're a child who needs help," Ruth replied. "That's all I need to know." But even as she spoke the words, Ruth wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. In the Arizona Territory of 1886, kindness toward Apaches was often seen as treason, and harboring one could have consequences she couldn't predict. For now, though, watching relief wash over Kiona's young face, Ruth decided that some risks were worth taking. After 3 years of living alone with only her grief for company, maybe it was time to remember what it felt like to share her space with another living soul. As evening approached and the desert air began to cool, Ruth showed Kiona where. She could wash at the pump behind the cabin and found her a clean shirt to replace her torn dress while it dried. The girl moved with quiet efficiency, clearly accustomed to making do with little and being grateful for small kindnesses. That night, as Kiona slept on a bedroll beside the table where Chua rested, Ruth lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the desert night. But now there was something new, mixed with the usual chorus of coyotes and night birds, the soft, steady breathing of someone who felt safe enough to sleep deeply. Ruth found herself wondering what tomorrow would bring, whether this unexpected encounter would prove to be a blessing or a complication she couldn't handle. But for tonight, her cabin felt less empty than it had in years, and that was enough. Ruth woke before dawn to find Kiona already awake, sitting beside Chua and humming a low, haunting melody that seemed to make the wounded rabbit's breathing easier. The girl hadn't moved from her post all night, and Ruth realized she'd been keeping vigil, watching for any sign that her companion might be slipping away. "How is he?" Ruth asked softly, not wanting to startle either the girl or the rabbit. "Stronger," Kiona replied, her voice carrying cautious hope. "The fever broke near midnight, and he drank some water when I offered it. I think your medicine is working." Ruth approached the makeshift sickbed and examined her patient. The rabbit's eyes were brighter, more alert, and the swelling around the splintered leg had reduced noticeably. Chua even attempted to lift his head when Ruth spoke to him, which was an encouraging sign. "You did well watching over him like that," Ruth said. "Healing takes time, but constant care makes all the difference." Kiona's face lit up with the first genuine smile Ruth had seen from her. It transformed her features completely, revealing glimpses of the carefree child she might have been under different circumstances. But the smile faded quickly, replaced by the cautious wariness that seemed to be her default expression. As Ruth prepared breakfast, she found herself studying Kiona more carefully in the morning light. The girl moved with a fluid grace that spoke of life lived mostly outdoors, and her hands showed calluses from hard work, despite her young age. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They held knowledge of violence and loss that no child should carry. "Kiona," Ruth said as she set out plates of eggs and biscuits, "yesterday you mentioned that everyone in your family was gone. Can you tell me what happened?" The girl's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and for a moment Ruth thought she wouldn't answer. When Kiona finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The blue coats came to our winter camp 3 moons ago," she began, staring down at her plate. They said we had to go to the reservation, that it was government orders. But my grandfather remembered what happened to other bands who went willingly to those places, how they got sick and died, how the children were taken away and never seen again. Ruth felt her stomach clench. She'd heard stories about conditions on the Apache reservations, though she'd never been sure how much to believe. The territorial newspapers painted a rosy picture of Indians learning to farm and live peacefully, but rumors from traders and drifters told different tales. "So your people refused to go?" Ruth prompted gently. Kiona nodded, her young face hardening with remembered pain. "My grandfather said we would rather die free in our own land than slowly starve behind walls. So when the soldiers came with their demands, we scattered into the mountains like our ancestors taught us. But something went wrong. The soldiers had Apache scouts with them," Kiona said, her voice thick with betrayal. "Men from other bands who had given up fighting and now hunted their own people for army gold. They knew our hiding places, our water sources, our escape routes." Ruth reached across the table and covered Kiona's small hand with her own. The girl's fingers were trembling, and Ruth could see the effort it took for her to continue the story. "We thought we were safe in the high caves near Eagle's Rest," Kiona went on. "It was a place my people had used for generations when enemies came hunting. But the scouts knew about it too. They led the soldiers right to us in the darkness before dawn." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken horrors. Ruth didn't need details to understand what had happened next. She'd lived on the frontier long enough to know how these conflicts usually ended. "How did you escape?" Ruth asked finally. "My mother pushed me into a crevice in the rock wall, just as the shooting started," Kiona said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "She told me to stay hidden, no matter what I heard, no matter how long it took for the sounds to stop. So I stayed in that dark crack in the stone while my family died around me." Ruth felt her own eyes filling with tears. The image of a young girl hiding in terror while her world collapsed was almost too painful to bear. Yet here sat Kiona, somehow still whole enough to care for an injured rabbit, still capable of trust despite everything she'd endured. "I stayed hidden for 2 days," Kiona continued. "When I finally came out, the soldiers were gone, but so was everyone I had ever loved. The scouts had taken anything of value, and the bodies were left for the vultures. Dear God," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking, "I buried them as best I could with rocks from the mountainside," Kiona said with heartbreaking dignity. "Then I took what little food remained and started walking. I didn't know where to go, only that I couldn't stay there with the ghosts." Ruth struggled to process the magnitude of what this child had experienced. To witness the murder of her entire family, then have the strength to perform burial rites and continue living. It spoke to a resilience that Ruth could barely comprehend. "How long have you been traveling alone?" Ruth asked. "Almost a full turn of the moon," Kiona replied. "I've been moving mostly at night, hiding during the day. The soldiers are still hunting for survivors, and there's a bounty on Apache scalps, even children's scalps." This last detail hit Ruth like a physical blow. She knew about the scalp bounties, official policy that paid hunters for proof of dead Apaches. The fact that it included children was something she'd tried not to think about too deeply. One of those moral compromises that frontier life seemed to demand. "That's how I found Chua," Kiona continued, her voice growing steadier, as she focused on her rabbit companion. "I was sheltering in a wash during a rainstorm when I heard crying. At first, I thought it might be a human child, but it was just this little one, alone and afraid like me." Ruth watched as Kiona gently stroked Chua's ears, the simple gesture revealing so much about the girl's character. Despite her own trauma and desperate circumstances, she'd still found room in her heart for another creature's suffering. "We've been traveling together ever since," Kiona said. He rides in my pack during the day, and at night I share my food. With him, sometimes it felt like he was the only thing keeping me from giving up entirely. The profound loneliness in that statement made Ruth's chest ache. She thought of her own dark moments after Patrick's death, when the silence of the empty cabin had seemed overwhelming. But at least she'd had memories of love to sustain her, a lifetime of shared experiences to draw upon. Kiona had nothing but a wounded rabbit and whatever strength she could summon from within herself. When Chua got caught in that trap yesterday morning, I thought I was going to lose him too, Kiona went on. I couldn't free him by myself, and I was afraid the trapline owner might come back and find us. That's when I remembered the stories about the healing woman by the red rocks. What stories? Ruth asked, curious despite herself. Traveling people talk, Kiona explained. Traders, scouts, even some soldiers. They spoke of a white woman who lived alone but wasn't like the others. They said she was kind to anyone who needed help, that she didn't ask questions or demand payment for her kindness. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks. She hadn't realized her occasional acts of charity had earned her a reputation among the territory's wandering population. It was both humbling and slightly concerning. Kindness could be dangerous if it attracted the wrong kind of attention. I was desperate enough to hope the stories might be true, Kiona continued, and when I saw your cabin with its neat garden and clean windows, I thought perhaps this might be a place where mercy still lived. The phrase struck Ruth deeply. Mercy still lived. When had she last thought of her simple acts of decency in such profound terms? After Patrick's death, she'd helped injured travelers and shared food with hungry drifters, partly from habit and partly because isolation could make a person strange if they weren't careful. She'd never considered that these small gestures might represent something larger. You took a considerable risk coming here, Ruth observed. How did you know I wouldn't turn you over to the authorities? Kiona was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. I didn't know, she admitted. But Chua was dying, and I had nowhere else to go. Sometimes you have to choose between certain death and possible betrayal. The matter-of-fact way she spoke of such desperate calculations broke Ruth's heart all over again. This child had been forced to develop survival instincts that most adults never needed, to make life and death decisions based on incomplete information and hope. As the morning progressed, Ruth found herself drawn into conversation with Kiona about topics both mundane and profound. The girl was remarkably well educated for someone her age, with knowledge spanning everything from desert plants and their uses to stories of Apache history and culture. But she also displayed curiosity about Ruth's life that was both touching and somewhat overwhelming. Why do you live alone? Kiona asked as they worked together to tend Chua's injury. Among my people, a woman without family would be adopted by others. No one lives entirely by themselves. Ruth paused in her careful rewrapping of the rabbit's splint. How to explain? The complex mix of grief, stubbornness, and fear that had led to her isolation. I wasn't always alone, Ruth said finally. I had a husband, Patrick. He died 3 winters ago, and after that I found it easier to manage on my own than to depend on others. Easier but not happier, Kiona asked with insight that seemed beyond her years. No, Ruth admitted, not happier, but sometimes easier is all we can manage. Kiona nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. After my family died, I thought about lying down in the desert and letting the sun take me. It would have been easier than continuing, but then I found Chua, and he needed me to be strong. The parallel between their experiences wasn't lost on Ruth. Both of them had survived devastating losses, both had chosen isolation as a form of protection, and both had found reasons to continue in their care for smaller, more vulnerable creatures. Do you miss your old life? Keona asked as she offered water to Chua, who drank eagerly from her cupped palm. Ruth considered the question carefully. "I miss feeling safe," she said eventually. "I miss believing that tomorrow would be much like today, that the people I loved would still be there when I woke up. But I've learned that kind of certainty was always an illusion." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My grandmother used to say that the only certain thing about life is uncertainty, Keona replied. She said the secret was learning to find joy in small moments, because those were the only ones we could truly count on. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was, Keona said with a sad smile. She taught me to read the desert, signs to find water and food and shelter. But most importantly, she taught me that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about staying human while you do it. Ruth found herself thinking about that phrase throughout the day. Staying human while you survive. It was a concept that challenged much of what she'd accepted about frontier life, where hardship often seemed to require a certain hardening of the heart. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Ruth noticed something that made her pulse quicken, dust on the horizon, moving in a way that suggested riders rather than wind. She casually moved to the window for a better view, trying not to alarm Keona. "What is it?" Keona asked, her survival instincts immediately alert to Ruth's change in posture. "Probably nothing," Ruth said, though her hand instinctively moved toward the rifle she kept loaded by the door. "Just riders passing through, happens sometimes." But as the dust cloud grew larger and more distinct, Ruth could make out individual figures, 4 mounted men moving with military precision directly toward her homestead. Her heart began to race as she realized this wasn't a casual visit. "Keona," Ruth said, trying to keep her voice calm, "I need you to take Chua and hide in the root cellar behind the cabin. There's a trap door covered with canvas. Can you find it?" The girl's face went pale with understanding. "Soldiers," she whispered. "I don't know yet," Ruth replied, "but better safe than sorry. Take some food and water with you, and don't come out until you're certain it's safe." Keona moved with practiced efficiency, gathering Chua and the few supplies she'd accumulated during her stay. As she prepared to slip out the back door, she turned to Ruth with eyes full of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything. If something happens to you because of me, I'll never forgive myself." "Nothing's going to happen," Ruth said with more confidence than she felt. "This is probably just a routine patrol. I'll send them on their way, and you can come back inside." But as the riders drew closer and Ruth could make out the blue of cavalry uniforms, she realized that Keona's presence in her home was about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. Ruth watched Keona disappear around the back of the cabin, then forced herself to move with deliberate calm as she prepared for the approaching riders. She smoothed her hair, checked that her dress was presentable, and positioned herself on the front porch with a bucket of chicken feed. The picture of a frontier woman going about her daily chores without a care in the world. The 4 cavalrymen rode into her yard with the confident authority of men who expected cooperation rather than resistance. Their leader, a captain by his stripes, was younger than Ruth had expected, probably no more than 30, with the kind of clean-shaven face that spoke of recent arrival from back east. His uniform was immaculate despite the desert dust, and his pale blue eyes surveyed Ruth's property with calculating precision. "Ma'am," the captain said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that managed to be both polite and condescending. "Captain James Morrison, United States Cavalry. Sorry to disturb your morning, but we're conducting a search of all homesteads in this area." "A search?" Ruth kept her voice pleasantly curious, as if the concept were mildly interesting rather than terrifying. "Whatever for, Captain?" Apache raiders, ma'am. We have reason to believe survivors from the Eagle's Rest engagement may have moved into this territory. They're considered extremely dangerous, and we're checking every ranch and cabin to ensure civilians' safety. Ruth's blood chilled at the mention of Eagle's Rest. That had to be where Keona's family was killed, which meant these soldiers might very well be the same ones who had massacred innocent people in their sleep. She fought to keep her expression neutral. How thoughtful of the army to be concerned about our welfare, Ruth said, injecting just enough frontier sarcasm to sound authentic. I haven't seen hide nor hair of any Indians around here, Captain. Nothing but coyotes and the occasional rattlesnake. One of the other soldiers, a grizzled sergeant with tobacco-stained teeth, spat into the dust and spoke up. Begging your pardon, Captain, but Apache don't always show themselves when they're scouting. Could be watching from them rocks right now, planning mischief. The captain nodded gravely. Sergeant Williams makes a good point, Mrs. Callahan. These aren't reservation Indians we're dealing with. They're hostiles with nothing left to lose. The survivor we're tracking is particularly dangerous. Survivor? Ruth asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. A young female, probably armed and certainly desperate, Captain Morrison explained. She escaped during our cleanup operation and has been stealing from ranches and trading posts ever since. The territorial governor has authorized a substantial bounty for her capture. Ruth felt sick at the casual way he described hunting a child as a cleanup operation, but she forced herself to nod sympathetically. Well, I certainly hope you catch her before she causes any real trouble. A woman living alone can't be too careful these days. Indeed, the captain agreed. Which is why I'm afraid we'll need to search your premises, ma'am. Standard procedure when we're tracking hostiles. I'm sure you understand. Ruth's mind raced. The root cellar where Keona was hiding would be obvious to any thorough search, and there was no way she could refuse without arousing suspicion. Her only hope was to control the search somehow, guide them away from the most dangerous areas. Of course, Captain. Though I'm afraid there's not much to see, just a simple widow's homestead. Perhaps you'd like some coffee while your men conduct their search. The desert heat can be brutal on riders. Captain Morrison's expression softened slightly at the offer of hospitality. That's very kind, Mrs. Callahan. Coffee would be most welcome. As Ruth led the captain into her cabin, she prayed silently that Keona would have the sense to stay hidden no matter what she heard. The other 3 soldiers began their search of the outbuildings, and Ruth could hear them moving around the property with military efficiency. Inside the cabin, Captain Morrison's eyes immediately went to the table where Chua lay recovering. The rabbit was alert now, watching the stranger with the wariness of a wild creature that sensed potential danger. Interesting pet, the captain observed, approaching the table with curiosity rather than suspicion. Found him caught in a trap yesterday morning, Ruth explained, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Poor thing's leg was broken, something awful. I've always had a soft spot for injured critters. Commendable, Morrison said, though his attention was already moving to other aspects of the cabin. Ruth watched nervously as his gaze catalogued details. The 2 plates on the drying rack, the extra blanket folded on the chair, the small moccasins she hadn't thought to hide. You've had visitors recently, the captain stated, rather than asked, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Ruth's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to laugh. In a manner of speaking, old Pete Hendricks stopped by 2 days ago with a broke wagon wheel. I fed him supper and let him sleep in the barn while his mule rested. That man could eat enough for 3 people, I swear. It wasn't entirely a lie. Pete had indeed stopped by last week, though not recently. But Ruth hoped the partial truth would be convincing enough to explain any evidence of additional occupancy. Captain Morrison nodded, seemingly satisfied, but Ruth noticed he was still studying the cabin with professional thoroughness. When his eyes lingered on the small pile of torn fabric in her mending basket, pieces of Kiona's dress that Ruth had been planning to repair, she felt her pulse spike dangerously. "Captain," Sergeant Williams called from outside, "you'd better—" "Come see this." Ruth's heart stopped as she followed Morrison onto the porch. The sergeant was standing near her vegetable garden, holding something that made Ruth's blood turn to ice, a piece of doeskin fabric caught on her garden fence, clearly torn from Apache clothing. "Fresh as yesterday," Williams said with satisfaction. "And look here, footprints leading toward the back of the property, small ones, could be our hostile." Captain Morrison examined the fabric with growing excitement. "Excellent work, Sergeant. Have the men spread out and search every inch of this homestead. Check the barn, the chicken coop, any structure large enough to hide a person." Ruth fought down panic as she watched the soldiers begin their systematic search. They were professionals, trained in tracking and apprehension. It would only be a matter of minutes before they discovered the root cellar. "Mrs. Callahan," Captain Morrison said, his earlier courtesy now replaced by stern authority. "I'm going to ask you directly, have you seen any Apache in this area? Any at all?" Ruth met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Captain, if I had seen hostile Indians near my home, don't you think I would have reported it immediately? A woman alone doesn't take chances with her safety." "Perhaps," Morrison said slowly, "but some folks on the frontier have peculiar ideas about helping Indians, even dangerous ones. Misguided mercy that puts everyone at risk. I assure you, Captain, I have no misguided sympathies toward people who would harm innocent settlers." The irony of the statement, spoken while she actively concealed a child whose family had been slaughtered by these very soldiers, wasn't lost on Ruth, but desperation made liars of even honest people. A commotion from behind the cabin interrupted their conversation. Two soldiers were arguing about something they'd found, their voices carrying clearly in the dry air. "I tell you it's fresh," one was saying. "Somebody's been using this cellar recent-like." "Could be the woman storing vegetables," the other replied. "Lots of homesteaders got root cellars." Ruth felt the world tilt around her. They'd found Kiona's hiding place. In moments, they would discover not just an Apache child, but clear evidence that Ruth had been lying to federal soldiers, a crime that could result in imprisonment or worse. "Captain." Morrison was already moving toward the sound of the voices, his hand resting on his sidearm. Ruth followed, her mind frantically searching for any possible way to salvage the situation. What she found was worse than her worst fears. The two soldiers had discovered the root cellar's entrance and were in the process of lifting the heavy wooden trapdoor. In seconds, they would see Kiona cowering in the darkness below, clutching her wounded rabbit. "Captain Morrison," Ruth called out desperately, "before your men go down there, I should warn you about the rattlesnake." The soldiers froze, the trapdoor half open. Ruth's heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst, but she pressed on with her improvised deception. "Biggest diamondback I've ever seen took up residence down there last week," she continued, amazed at how convincing she sounded. "I've been meaning to get someone out here to deal with it, but haven't had the chance. Things mean as sin and aggressive as a rabid dog." Sergeant Williams immediately stepped back from the opening. "How big we talking, Ma'am?" "Near 6 feet long and thick as my arm," Ruth replied without hesitation. "Made an awful racket when it first moved in. Must have killed something down there because the smell was terrible for days." The soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Rattlesnakes were a genuine danger in the territory, and the prospect of encountering a large, aggressive specimen in a confined space was enough to give even experienced cavalry troopers pause. "We should smoke it out first," one soldier suggested. "Or maybe shoot down into the cellar from up here." "No," Ruth said quickly, then forced herself to moderate her tone. "That is, if you shoot blindly into my root cellar, you're likely to damage my winter food stores, and smoking it out could take hours. The thing's probably coiled up in the deepest corner. Captain Morrison studied Ruth's face intently, as if trying to read her thoughts. She met his gaze as steadily as possible, praying that her desperate improvisation would hold up under scrutiny. "There's something you're not telling me, Mrs. Callahan," the captain said slowly. "I can sense it." Ruth's mind raced through possible responses, weighing each option for maximum believability. Finally, she sighed dramatically and looked appropriately embarrassed. "Well, if you must know, Captain, I've been using that cellar for more than just vegetables," she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a shameful secret. "My late husband left behind several jugs of corn whiskey, and I've been selling it to passing traders. It's not entirely legal, I know, but a widow has to make ends meet somehow." The explanation had the ring of truth. Illegal liquor sales were common on the frontier, and a struggling widow might well resort to such measures for survival. More importantly, it provided a reason for Ruth to be nervous about official scrutiny that had nothing to do with harboring fugitives. Captain Morrison's expression shifted from suspicion to understanding, mixed with mild disapproval. "Mrs. Callahan, while I don't condone illegal alcohol sales, that's a matter for territorial marshals, not the cavalry. Our concern is Apache raiders, not liquor violations." "I understand, Captain," Ruth replied, maintaining her embarrassed facade. "But you can see why I'd rather not advertise my little side business." The captain nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. But Ruth could see he was still torn between the evidence suggesting Apache presence and the practical difficulties of searching a rattlesnake-infested cellar. "Sergeant Williams," Morrison finally decided, "post a man here to watch the cellar entrance. If there's anyone hiding down there, Apache or otherwise, thirst and hunger will drive them out eventually. We'll continue searching the other buildings." Ruth's heart sank. A guard on the cellar meant Kiona would remain trapped, unable to emerge for food, water, or fresh air. The child might survive for a day or two, but eventually she would have to surrender or risk dying of dehydration. As the soldiers resumed their search of the property, Ruth found herself in an impossible situation. She couldn't help Kiona without exposing them both, but she couldn't abandon the child either. The girl had already lost everything once. Ruth refused to be the cause of her second betrayal. The search continued for another hour, with soldiers examining every corner of Ruth's homestead with professional thoroughness. They found evidence of recent occupancy, scuff marks, disturbed dust, small signs that someone had been living there who wasn't supposed to be, but nothing definitive enough to prove Apache presence. Captain Morrison seemed increasingly frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence. Ruth could see him weighing the ambiguous signs against the practical difficulties of conducting a more intensive search. "Mrs. Callahan," the captain said finally, "I want you to understand something clearly. Harboring Apache fugitives is a federal crime punishable by imprisonment or death. If we discover that you've been less than truthful with us, the consequences will be severe. Captain, I give you my word as a Christian woman that I have not knowingly aided any Apache raiders." Ruth replied, technically truthful since she was helping a child, not a raider. Morrison studied her face one final time, then nodded curtly. "Very well. But we'll be posting patrols through this area regularly, and Sergeant Williams will remain here to watch your cellar until we're satisfied it contains nothing but vegetables and contraband whiskey." As the captain and two of his men prepared to depart, Ruth realized that her desperate deception had brought only temporary reprieve. Kiona was still trapped, still in mortal danger, and now there would be a soldier watching her hiding place continuously. But as she watched Captain Morrison mount his horse, Ruth noticed something that gave her a spark of hope. Sergeant Williams was the oldest of the soldiers, clearly nearing retirement age, and he moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints ached after long days in the saddle. Perhaps, Ruth thought, An aging sergeant might be susceptible to feminine wiles and frontier hospitality. It was her only chance to save both Kiona and herself from the trap that was slowly closing around them. Sergeant Williams settled himself on Ruth's porch with the weary satisfaction of a man who had found shade and a comfortable chair after hours in the desert sun. He positioned himself where he could see both the root cellar entrance and the main approaches to the homestead, then pulled out a battered pipe and began the ritual of loading it with tobacco. Ruth observed him through her kitchen window as she prepared what she hoped would be the most persuasive meal of her life. Williams appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in harsh climates. More importantly, he moved like someone whose bones had been jarred by too many years of military life. Exactly the kind of man who might appreciate unexpected comfort. She had perhaps 6 hours of daylight remaining to devise a plan that would save Kiona without getting them both killed. The child had been trapped in that underground space for nearly 3 hours now, and Ruth knew that panic and claustrophobia might drive her to make desperate choices. She needed to act quickly. Ruth loaded a tray with her best china, the delicate cups and saucers that had been her grandmother's, along with fresh coffee, warm biscuits, honey butter, and a generous slice of the apple pie she'd been saving for Sunday. If she was going to manipulate a career soldier, she would need every advantage domesticity could provide. "Sergeant Williams," she called as she stepped onto the porch, "I thought you might appreciate some refreshment while you keep watch. This desert heat can be brutal on a man in uniform." Williams looked up from his pipe with surprise and genuine pleasure. "That's mighty kind of you, ma'am. Been a long time since anyone offered me china cups and real coffee." Ruth settled into the chair across from him, pouring coffee with practiced grace while studying his reactions. The sergeant's eyes widened at the quality of the service, and she could see him responding to the implied respect of being treated like a gentleman rather than just another soldier. "This is beautiful work," Williams said, examining the delicate cup with calloused hands. "Reminds me of pieces my mother had back in Ohio." "Thank you, Sergeant. They belonged to my grandmother. Came all the way from Ireland in a trunk that survived 3 different ocean crossings. She always said that maintaining civilization was partly about remembering that even in rough circumstances, people deserve to be treated with dignity." Ruth had chosen her words carefully, planting the seed of an idea that dignity and humanity mattered even in military operations. Williams nodded approvingly as he sipped the coffee, clearly a man who appreciated both quality and philosophy. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman," he said. "Not many folks out here remember the niceties. Most places I've been posted, they throw food at soldiers like we're dogs begging scraps. I've always believed that how we treat others reflects who we are inside," Ruth replied, refilling his cup. "My late husband Patrick used to say that kindness costs nothing but pays dividends in ways we rarely expect." As they talked, Ruth began to understand the man she was dealing with. Williams was career military, but not by choice. Economic necessity had driven him to enlist decades ago, and he'd stayed because the army provided steady pay and purpose. He spoke fondly of a sister in Ohio who wrote him letters, and wistfully of a farm he hoped to buy when his service ended. Most importantly, Ruth sensed that Williams was tired. Tired of chasing ghosts across desert wasteland, tired of hunting people who were often no more dangerous than frightened children, tired of orders that sometimes conflicted with his personal sense of right and wrong. "Sergeant," Ruth said, carefully after they'd established a comfortable rapport, "may I ask you something about this Apache situation? As a woman living alone, I confess I'm somewhat confused about the real level of danger." William set down his coffee cup and considered the question seriously. "Well, ma'am, I reckon it depends on what you mean by danger. Are there Apache out there who would kill settlers given the chance? Certainly. But are they the bloodthirsty savages the newspapers make them out to be? That's more complicated." Ruth leaned forward with interest, sensing an opening in his defenses. "How so?" "I've been fighting Indians for 23 years, Williams said slowly, "and I've learned that most times they're no different from us. They want to protect their families, hold on to their land, live according to their own customs. When they fight, it's usually because they see no other choice, even the ones you're hunting now." Williams was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert landscape. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of accumulated experience and moral complexity. "The Eagle's Rest operation wasn't my finest hour," he admitted. "Captain Morrison is young, eager to make his reputation by bringing in results. Sometimes that eagerness leads to decisions that experienced soldiers might question." Ruth felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the opening she'd hoped for. A veteran soldier with doubts about the morality of his current mission. "What happened at Eagle's Rest?" she asked gently. Williams took a long draw on his pipe, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal to a civilian. "Official report says we engaged a band of hostile Apache who were planning raids on civilian targets. But the truth is, we attacked a winter camp full of old people, women and children who were just trying to survive." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes, thinking of Kiona's description of that terrible morning. "Were there any survivors?" "Few," Williams said quietly. "Captain Morrison was thorough, said we couldn't risk leaving anyone who might carry tales or seek revenge. I've seen a lot of ugly things in my years of service, Mrs. Callahan, but that morning sits heavy on my conscience. And now you're hunting the survivors." "Now I'm following orders," Williams corrected, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Though I sometimes wonder if the person we're tracking is really the dangerous, hostile Captain Morrison claims, or just a terrified child trying to stay alive." Ruth made her decision in that moment. This man had honor beneath his uniform, conscience that warred with duty. He was exactly the kind of soldier who might be willing to look the other way if presented with the right circumstances. "Sergeant Williams," she said quietly, "what if I told you that the person you're hunting isn't a dangerous raider at all, but a young girl who watched her entire family murdered and has been wandering the desert alone for weeks?" Williams went very still, his eyes searching Ruth's face. "Intently, ma'am, that would be a very dangerous thing for you to tell me." "Dangerous for whom?" For you, if you're harboring a fugitive. For me, if I fail to arrest someone I know to be wanted by the army, and most of all for any Apache child unlucky enough to be in this situation." Ruth took a deep breath, knowing she was about to cross a line from which there could be no retreat. "Her name is Kiona. She's 10 years old. She's been hiding in my root cellar for the past 3 hours while you and your men search my property, and she's probably terrified out of her mind." Williams set down his pipe with deliberate care, his weathered face showing no expression. For a long moment the only sound was the desert wind rustling through the sagebrush. "Mrs. Callahan," he said finally, "you realize what you're confessing to?" "I'm confessing to showing Christian mercy to a frightened child," Ruth replied, firmly. "If that's a crime, then I'll stand before God and answer for it gladly." Williams studied her face for what felt like an eternity. Ruth could see him weighing duty against conscience, orders against humanity, the requirements of military service against the deeper obligations of moral decency. "This child," he said slowly, "she's the one we've been tracking?" "Oh, yes. And you've been hiding her, feeding her, caring for her?" "Yes." "Even knowing the penalties for harboring fugitive Apache?" "Yes." Williams leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, Ruth saw something that hadn't been there before, resolve mixed with weary acceptance. "Mrs. Callahan, I've served in this army for more years than I care to count. I've followed orders that made sense and orders that didn't, orders I was proud of and orders that shamed me, but I've never yet been ordered to wage war on children, and I don't intend to start now." Ruth felt hope bloom in her chest, but she forced herself to remain cautious. "What does that mean, Sergeant?" "It means," William said carefully, "that sometimes an old soldier's eyes aren't what they used to be. Sometimes he might sit guard over a root cellar all day and never see anyone come or go, even if someone did." Ruth understood the coded language immediately. Williams was offering her a chance, a window of opportunity to get Kiona away from the homestead without officially acknowledging her presence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. And if Captain Morrison asks for your report, I'll tell him the truth. That I watched your root cellar faithfully and saw no evidence of Apache activity. If pressed, I might mention the large rattlesnake I observed near the entrance, which would explain why I didn't investigate too closely. Ruth felt tears of gratitude flowing down her cheeks. "Sergeant, why are you doing this?" Williams relit his pipe with steady hands, taking his time before answering. "Because 23 years ago, I enlisted to protect American citizens and uphold justice. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what those concepts really meant. Maybe it's time I remembered. What do you need from me?" "Time," Williams said simply. "Wait until after midnight, when the moon sets and visibility drops. Get the child away from here, far away. Take her somewhere the army won't think. To look somewhere she can disappear into the general population." Ruth's mind immediately began working through possibilities. There were settlements to the south where mixed populations of Mexican, Indian, and white families lived together with less rigid social boundaries. A child like Kiona might blend in there, especially if she had proper documentation. "There's a Catholic mission near Tucson," Ruth said thoughtfully. "The priests there take in orphans, regardless of background. If I could get Kiona there safely, she might have a chance at a normal life." "How would you travel?" "Wagon would be too visible, too slow." Ruth considered the logistics carefully. "Horseback, traveling at night, staying off the main roads. I know this territory well enough to avoid patrol routes. It would take 3 days, maybe 4 if we're careful." Williams nodded approvingly. "Sound thinking, but Mrs. Callahan, you need to understand, if you're caught, I can't protect you. As far as official records show, I saw nothing suspicious here today." "I understand, Sergeant, and I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm grateful for your conscience and your courage." "Don't thank me yet," Williams warned. "We still have to get through the next 18 hours without arousing suspicion. Captain Morrison may return, and he's not as willing as I am to overlook inconsistencies." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the desert air. Ruth and Williams exchanged worried glances as they spotted dust clouds on the horizon, multiple riders moving fast toward the homestead. "Company coming," Williams observed, his military bearing returning instantly. "Mrs. Callahan, whatever you do, stay calm and follow my lead. We're just 2 people having coffee and conversation while I keep watch over your property." Ruth quickly began clearing the fancy china from the table, replacing it with everyday cups that wouldn't suggest special hospitality. Williams moved to his official watching position, pipe clenched between his teeth, as he scanned the approaches to the homestead with professional alertness. The approaching riders resolved into 3 familiar figures: Captain Morrison and 2 soldiers, returning at speed with expressions that suggested urgency. Ruth's heart sank as she realized their carefully constructed deception was about to face its greatest test. Captain Morrison dismounted before his horse had come to a complete stop, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked disturbingly like anticipation. "Sergeant Williams, report." "All quiet, sir," Williams replied crisply. "No movement around the cellar entrance, no suspicious activity anywhere on the property." "Excellent," Morrison said, but his smile was predatory rather than pleased. "Because we just received very interesting information from Apache scouts working with Colonel Henderson's unit. It seems our fugitive has a distinctive companion, a cottontail rabbit with an injured hind leg." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face as Morrison's eyes locked onto hers with unmistakable triumph. The captain had returned not to check on progress, but to spring a trap he'd been setting since his first visit. The silence that followed Captain Morrison's revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Ruth felt the world crystallize around her, the desert heat pressing against her skin, the weight of Sergeant Williams' gaze, the predatory satisfaction in Morrison's pale blue eyes as he savored his moment of triumph. "I'm sorry, Captain," Ruth said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "but I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting." Morrison's smile widened as he gestured toward the cabin where Chua lay recovering on the kitchen table. "Mrs. Callahan, Apache children, often keep small animals as companions, pets, if you will. Our scouts reported that the fugitive we're tracking was seen with a distinctive cottontail rabbit, injured hind leg, missing patches of fur. Quite distinctive, actually." Ruth felt her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse, but she forced herself to maintain the facade. "Captain, I found that rabbit caught in a trap yesterday morning. Are you suggesting that every injured animal in the territory belongs to Apache fugitives?" "Not every injured animal, no," Morrison replied, his tone becoming dangerously conversational. "But when we find such a specific creature in the home of a woman who's been unusually nervous during our investigation, patterns begin to emerge." Sergeant Williams shifted slightly in his position, and Ruth caught the almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning to remain silent, to let him handle the situation. But Ruth realized with growing clarity that words alone would not save them now. Morrison had come prepared for confrontation. "Sergeant Williams," the captain continued, "I want you to bring that rabbit out here where we can examine it properly. If it matches our scout's description exactly, we'll know we're on the right track." Williams hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Morrison to notice. "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" "No, sir," Williams replied crisply. "Just wondering if we should be concerned about that rattlesnake Mrs. Callahan mentioned. Thing's been aggressive all day." Morrison's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What? A rattlesnake?" Before Williams could respond, Ruth made a decision that surprised even herself. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice taking on a steel she hadn't known she possessed, "I think it's time we dispensed with these games." Both soldiers turned to stare at her, Morrison with anticipation, Williams with barely concealed alarm. Ruth walked to the edge of her porch, positioning herself where she could see both men clearly. "You're absolutely right about the rabbit," she continued, her words falling like stones into still water. "Chua does belong to an Apache child, a 10-year-old girl named Kiona, whose entire family was massacred by soldiers 3 weeks ago while they slept in what they thought was a safe winter camp." Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but Ruth pressed on relentlessly. "She's been wandering the desert alone since then, caring for nothing but that injured rabbit, and trying to survive in a world that wants her dead simply for existing." "Mrs. Callahan," Williams said urgently, "you need to stop talking." "No, Sergeant," Ruth replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I've been quiet too long already. Captain Morrison wants to play games of cat and mouse. Fine, let's finish this honestly." Morrison drew his revolver with smooth precision, the barrel aimed squarely at Ruth's chest. "Mrs. Callahan, you are under arrest for harboring fugitive Apache and providing aid to enemies of the United States government. And you, Captain," Ruth shot back, "are under the delusion that murdering children makes you a hero instead of a coward. The words hit Morrison like a physical blow, his face flushing dark red with rage. "You have no idea what you're talking about, woman. Those Apache killed innocent settlers, burned homesteads, tortured families. What we did was justice." "What you did," Ruth said with quiet intensity, "was slaughter sleeping people because it was easier than actually tracking down real raiders. You killed grandmothers and babies and called it military victory." Morrison's gun hand trembled with fury, and Ruth realized she had pushed him past the point of rational control. But something else was happening. Sergeant Williams was moving, with subtle purpose, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary. "Enough," Morrison snarled. "Private Henderson, Private Martinez, search every inch of this property. Find that Apache brat and bring her to me alive. I want to question her about other survivors before we collect the bounty." The two soldiers began moving toward the various outbuildings, but Williams stepped into their path with casual authority. "Begging your pardon, Captain, but shouldn't we secure the area first? If there's a hostile on this property, charging around blindly could get someone killed." Morrison whirled on his sergeant with barely controlled rage. "Are you questioning my tactical decisions, Sergeant?" "Just suggesting caution, sir," Williams replied with perfect military bearing. "After 23 years of Indian fighting, I've learned that rushing into unknown situations can be dangerous." Ruth watched this exchange with growing understanding. Williams was buying time, trying to give her an opportunity to warn Kiona or create some kind of diversion. But Ruth realized that conventional tactics wouldn't work here. Morrison was too intelligent, too suspicious, too determined to claim his prize. "Captain Morrison," Ruth said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension, "before your men, tear my property apart. Let me save everyone some trouble." She walked deliberately toward the back of the cabin, ignoring Morrison's shouted commands to stop, ignoring the sound of boots pounding after her. When she reached the concealed entrance to the root cellar, she knelt beside the trapdoor and called softly, "Kiona, child, I need you to come up now. It's time." The response came immediately, the sound of someone moving in the confined space below, then Kiona's voice, muffled but audible. "Ruth, are they going to hurt us?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Ruth replied honestly. "But hiding won't solve anything now. Come up and bring Chua with you." Morrison and his soldiers had surrounded the cellar entrance by the time the trapdoor lifted from below. What emerged was exactly what Ruth had described. A small Apache girl, thin from weeks of hard travel, clutching an injured rabbit against her chest with protective desperation. Kiona's dark eyes immediately assessed the situation. Armed. Soldiers, Ruth standing defiant but clearly defeated, the unmistakable tension of violence barely held in check. But instead of cowering or trying to run, the child did something that stunned everyone present. She stood up straight, looked Captain Morrison directly in the eye, and spoke in clear, precise English. "My name is Kiona of the Chiricahua people. I'm not afraid of you." Morrison stared at her for a moment, clearly not expecting such composure from a child he'd been hunting like an animal. "Well, well," he said finally. "The little savage has some spirit. That will make questioning her more interesting." "She's just a child," Williams said quietly, but his words carried an edge of warning that made Morrison glance at him sharply. "She's a witness to Apache military capabilities and a source of information about other survivors," Morrison corrected. "She's also worth $500 in bounty money, which will look very good in my service record." Ruth felt something cold and implacable settle in her chest as she watched Morrison look at Kiona with the calculating gaze of a man pricing livestock. This was the moment when civilized pretense finally fell away, when the true nature of what she was fighting became clear. "Captain," she said with deceptive calm, "if you harm this child, you'll have to kill me as well. Because I will not. Rest until every newspaper from here to Washington knows what kind of man the army sent to protect innocent settlers." Morrison's laugh was ugly and dismissive. "Mrs. Callahan, you seem to think your word would carry weight against an official military report. Who do you think the territorial government will believe? A decorated cavalry officer or a frontier widow who admits to harboring fugitive Apache?" "They might believe Sergeant Williams," Ruth replied, her eyes finding the older soldier's weathered face. "A man with 23 years of honorable service who's seen enough to know the difference between justice and murder." All eyes turned to Williams, who stood perfectly still for a long moment, clearly aware that the next words out of his mouth would determine not just his own fate, but the lives of Ruth and Kiona as well. "Captain," Williams said finally, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated experience and hard-won wisdom, "this operation has gone far enough. We came here to apprehend dangerous hostiles, not to terrorize widows and children." Morrison's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color that suggested imminent violence. "Sergeant, you are dangerously close to insubordination. Stand down immediately." "No, sir," Williams replied calmly. "I don't believe I will." The words hung in the desert air like a challenge that could not be withdrawn. Ruth realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. A career soldier choosing conscience over orders, humanity over duty, right over expedience. Morrison raised his revolver, but now it was aimed at Williams rather than Ruth. "Sergeant, you are relieved of duty and under arrest for insubordination and failure to follow direct orders." Williams didn't flinch. "Captain, you're making a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your career. Whatever reputation you think you're building by hunting children will crumble the moment real scrutiny is applied. The only scrutiny that matters comes from my superior officers," Morrison snarled, "and they care about results, not methods." It was at that moment that Kiona stepped forward, still clutching Chua but moving with purpose that belied her young age. "Captain Morrison," she said in her clear, precise English, "you killed my family because you thought no one would remember them, no one would speak their names or tell their stories." Morrison turned his attention back to the child, his expression a mixture of annoyance and cruel amusement. "That's right, little savage. Dead Indians tell no tales. But I am not dead," Kiona continued, her voice growing stronger, "and I remember everything. I know the names of every person who died in that camp, including the babies who had not yet learned to walk. I know which soldiers fired first, which ones showed mercy, and which ones took trophies from the bodies." Ruth watched Morrison's face change as the implications of Kiona's words sank in. This wasn't just a child who had witnessed a military action. She was a living record of potential war crimes, someone whose testimony could destroy careers and reputations if it ever reached the wrong ears. "She knows too much," Morrison said, but he was no longer speaking to anyone present. He was thinking out loud, working through a problem that had just become significantly more complex. "Captain," Williams said urgently, "whatever you're considering, don't do it. There are witnesses here, official records of our presence. If anything happens to these civilians, questions will be asked." Morrison's smile was cold as winter wind. "Sergeant, you seem to forget that I write the official reports, and tragic accidents happen all the time on the frontier. Apache raids, house fires, rattlesnake bites, so many ways for inconvenient witnesses to disappear." Ruth realized with crystalline clarity that Morrison had just revealed his true intentions. He hadn't come here to arrest anyone. He'd come to eliminate problems that threatened his version of events. The bounty money was secondary to ensuring that no one survived who could contradict his official narrative. "Williams," Ruth said quietly, "how fast can you draw?" The sergeant's eyes flicked to Morrison's gun hand, assessing angles and distances with professional expertise. "Fast enough," he replied grimly, "but not fast enough to save all of us." "Then we'd better hope," Ruth said, reaching slowly. Toward the rifle, she kept propped beside her kitchen door. That speed isn't the only thing that matters in this fight. Morrison caught the movement and spun toward her, his revolver tracking with deadly precision. But in that instant of divided attention, several things happened simultaneously. Kiona dropped to the ground, rolling toward the dubious safety of the porch steps while shielding Chua with her body. Williams dove sideways, his own sidearm, clearing leather with the smooth efficiency of decades of practice. Ruth lunged for her rifle, knowing she would never reach it in time, but determined to try anyway. And in the desert beyond Ruth's homestead, unseen by the combatants preparing for violence, other eyes watched the unfolding confrontation with interest that went far beyond casual observation. The first gunshot shattered the afternoon silence like thunder in a cloudless sky, followed immediately by two more in rapid succession. But in the chaos of movement and desperation, it was impossible to tell who had fired first, who had found their target, and who might still be standing when the gun smoke cleared. What was certain, as dust settled and echoes faded across the Arizona landscape, was that the confrontation at Ruth Callahan's homestead had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. Whatever happened next would determine not just whether Ruth and Kiona survived the day, but whether justice or expedience would write the final chapter of their story. The gunsmoke hung in the desert air like morning mist, acrid and choking, as Ruth pushed herself up from the dirt where she'd thrown herself when the shooting started. Her ears rang from the concussion of firearms discharged at close range, but through the temporary deafness she could hear something that filled her with relief. Kiona's voice, speaking softly to Chua in Apache, which meant the child was alive. And unharmed, Sergeant Williams stood over Captain Morrison's motionless form, his service revolver still smoking in his weathered hand. The captain lay twisted in an unnatural position, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the cloudless Arizona sky, a spreading dark stain across his pristine uniform jacket. The two younger soldiers, Henderson and Martinez, had thrown down their weapons and stood with hands raised, faces pale with shock at seeing their commanding officer shot down by his own sergeant. "Williams," Private Henderson stammered. "What have you done? He was our captain, He was a murderer," Williams interrupted with quiet finality, "and I've spent too many years following orders from murderers. It ends here, it ends now." Ruth struggled to her feet, her legs shaking from adrenaline and relief, and moved immediately to where Kiona crouched behind the porch steps. The girl was shielding Chua with her body, but both seemed unharmed by the violence that had erupted around them. "Are you hurt?" Ruth asked, running her hands over Kiona's thin frame to check for injuries. "I am whole," Kiona replied, her young voice steady despite everything she'd just witnessed. "But I think everything has changed now." Ruth looked around at the scene of carnage in her front yard, a dead cavalry captain, two terrified soldiers, and a sergeant who had just committed what the military would certainly classify as murder, regardless of the moral justification. Kiona was right. Everything had indeed changed, and not in ways that offered simple solutions. It was then that Ruth became aware of new sounds. Horses approaching at a measured pace, too organized to be coincidental. The mysterious watchers she'd glimpsed earlier were finally revealing themselves, and Ruth felt her stomach clench with new anxiety. Had they jumped from the frying pan into the fire? What emerged from the heat shimmer of the desert was not what any of them had expected. A group of riders approached the homestead with military precision, but these were not cavalry soldiers. They wore the blue uniforms of the territorial marshals, led by a man whose silver badge caught the afternoon sun like a beacon of authority. "Well now," called the lead rider as he surveyed the scene with professional interest. "Looks like we arrived just in time to miss the excitement." Ruth recognized him immediately. Marshal Thomas Garrett, a legend throughout the Arizona Territory for his fairness and incorruptible nature. Garrett was known as a man who followed the law rather than political expedience, which made his presence both hopeful and terrifying. "Marshal Garrett," Sergeant Williams said, slowly holstering his weapon with movements designed to appear non-threatening. "I can explain what happened here." Garrett dismounted with the careful deliberation of a man who had seen enough violence to know that hasty movements could escalate dangerous situations. His deputies remained mounted but alert, hands resting casually near their sidearms. "Sure you can, Sergeant," Garrett replied, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in law enforcement. "But before we get to explanations, let's make sure everyone understands the current situation. Mrs. Callahan, are you and the child unharmed?" "We're fine, Marshal," Ruth said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Thanks to Sergeant Williams' intervention." Garrett's experienced eyes took in the scene with methodical precision. Morrison's body, the discarded weapons, the 2 young soldiers still standing with raised hands, and most importantly, Kiona, clutching her rabbit while watching the proceedings with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust uniforms of any kind. "Privates Henderson and Martinez," Garrett addressed the younger soldiers, "lower your hands and step away from the weapons on the ground. I want to hear your account of what transpired here." Henderson, the braver of the 2, found his voice first. "Marshal, Sergeant Williams shot Captain Morrison in cold blood. We were conducting an authorized search for Apache fugitives when the sergeant just opened fire on his commanding officer. Is that your version of events as well, Private Martinez?" Garrett asked. Martinez glanced nervously between his fellow soldier and the assembled adults, clearly struggling with conflicting loyalties. "Sir, that's what happened. But it's not the whole story. Captain Morrison was about to shoot Mrs. Callahan and the little girl. The sergeant was trying to protect them." Garrett nodded thoughtfully, making notes in a small leather journal he'd produced from his vest pocket. "Sergeant Williams, what's your account?" Williams straightened into perfect military posture, a career soldier preparing to give what might be his final report. "Marshal, Captain Morrison exceeded his authority and threatened the lives of innocent civilians. When I attempted to intervene through proper channels, he aimed his weapon at Mrs. Callahan and stated his intention to eliminate all witnesses to what he called an Apache raid. I used necessary force to prevent the murder of unarmed non-combatants. And you, Mrs. Callahan, what's your perspective on these events?" Ruth looked down at Kiona, who nodded almost imperceptibly, a child's permission to tell the truth that had been hidden too long. "Marshal, Captain Morrison and his men massacred Kiona's family 3 weeks ago while they slept in their winter camp. When the child came to me seeking help for her injured rabbit, I chose to provide shelter rather than turn her over to the people who had murdered her loved ones." Garrett's weathered face showed no surprise at this revelation, which made Ruth wonder exactly how much the Marshal already knew about recent military operations in the territory. And Captain Morrison's response when he discovered the child's presence. He made it clear that he intended to kill all of us to prevent testimony that might contradict his official reports, Ruth said firmly. "Sergeant Williams saved our lives." The Marshal spent several minutes questioning each witness separately, building a comprehensive picture of the events that had led to the shooting. Throughout this process, Kiona remained silent but attentive, clearly understanding that these proceedings would determine her fate as much as anyone's. Finally, Garrett closed his journal and addressed the group with the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "Based on the testimony I've heard and the physical evidence at the scene, I'm prepared to make preliminary rulings on this matter." Ruth held her breath, acutely aware that the next few minutes would determine whether she faced federal charges for harboring fugitives, whether Williams would hang for killing a superior officer, and most importantly, whether Kiona would finally find safety or be turned over to a system that had already failed her catastrophically. Private Henderson and Private Martinez. Garrett began, "You will be released to your unit with notation that you cooperated fully with this investigation. However, I strongly recommend that you both consider carefully what kind of officers you choose to follow in future operations." The two young soldiers nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to escape serious consequences for their association with Morrison's actions. Henderson gathered the courage to speak once more. "Marshal, for what it's worth, Sergeant Williams is a good man. He's always looked out for his soldiers, always tried to do the right thing." "Noted," Garrett replied. "Sergeant Williams, the situation you faced presents complex legal questions that will require review by territorial authorities. However, based on preliminary evidence, I'm inclined to view your actions as justified protection of civilian lives. You'll remain in my custody pending formal review, but I don't anticipate serious charges." William's shoulders sagged with relief, though he maintained his military bearing. "Thank you, Marshal. I knew the consequences when I made my choice, but I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people murdered." "Which brings us," Garrett continued, his gaze moving to Ruth and Kiona, "to the more complicated questions surrounding Mrs. Callahan's actions and the status of the child." Ruth's heart hammered as she realized this was the crucial moment, the point where official justice would either recognize the humanity of her choices or condemn them as violations of federal law. "Mrs. Callahan," Garrett said slowly, "harboring fugitive Apache is indeed a serious federal crime. However, the circumstances you describe suggest that the fugitive in question is actually a traumatized child seeking protection from the very people who murdered her family." "That's exactly what she is, Marshal," Ruth replied firmly. "A scared little girl who needed help, not a dangerous criminal." Garrett knelt down so he was at eye level with Kiona, speaking directly to her with gentle respect. "Young lady, I need to ask you some questions. Can you tell me your full name and how old you are?" "I am Kiona, daughter of White Eagle and Morning Star of the Chiricahua people," she replied with quiet dignity. "I have lived through 10 summers. And can you tell me what happened to your family?" Kiona's account of the massacre was brief but devastating in its simple honesty. She spoke of the pre-dawn attack, her mother's desperate attempt to hide her, the sounds of violence that had destroyed everything she'd ever known. Throughout her testimony, she maintained the composure of someone far older than her years, but Ruth could see the pain that lived behind her dark eyes. When Kiona finished speaking, Marshal Garrett was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what he'd heard. "Child, do you have any other family, anyone else who could care for you?" "All my blood relatives are dead," Kiona said simply. "But Mrs. Callahan has been kind to me, and I would like to stay with her, if she will have me." Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes at the child's words. Over the past few days, she had grown to love this brave, resilient girl who had somehow retained her capacity for trust, despite experiencing unimaginable loss. "Mrs. Callahan," Garrett asked, "are you prepared to take legal responsibility for this child's care and upbringing?" "Yes," Ruth said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." The Marshal made additional notes in his journal, then looked up with something that might have been a smile. "Very well. Given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, I'm prepared to make the following disposition. Mrs. Callahan, you will face no federal charges for your actions, which I'm classifying as humanitarian aid to a refugee rather than harboring a fugitive. Kiona will be placed in your legal custody, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." Ruth felt her knees go weak with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Marshal. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Garrett warned. "There will be paperwork, official reviews, and probably some uncomfortable questions from territorial authorities. But I believe justice is better served by keeping families together than by separating children from people who genuinely care about their welfare. As the marshal and his deputies prepared to depart with their prisoners and their report, Ruth realized that this ending was also a beginning. She and Kiona would face challenges ahead, legal complications, social prejudice, the practical difficulties of building a life together across cultural boundaries. But they would face those challenges together as a family chosen by circumstances and cemented by love rather than blood. Ruth looked down at Kiona, who was gently stroking Chua's soft fur, and saw not a frightened refugee, but a daughter who had somehow found her way home. "Kiona," Ruth said softly, "there's something I need to ask you. Are you sure you want to stay here with me? It won't be easy, and there may be people who don't approve of our arrangement." Kiona looked up with those ancient eyes that had seen too much sorrow, but still held room for hope. "Mrs. Ruth," she said, using the formal address that somehow sounded like the most natural thing in the world, "you opened your door when I had nowhere else to go. You cared for Chua when he was dying. You protected me when soldiers came to take me away. Why would I want to be anywhere else?" Ruth knelt down and pulled the child into her arms, feeling Kiona's thin frame relax against her chest with the absolute trust of someone who had finally found safety. Between them, Chua nestled contentedly, his injured leg healing well and his bright eyes alert with the curiosity of a creature who no longer feared for its survival. As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ruth Callahan stood on her porch with her newly adopted daughter, watching the last of the day's drama disappear into the distance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions to answer, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, for the first time in years, Ruth's cabin would be filled with more than just silence and memories. Tonight, there would be the soft sounds of a child's breathing, the gentle rustling of a recovering rabbit in his nest of blankets, and the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that sometimes, when the world seemed intent on destroying everything, good and innocent, ordinary people could still choose courage over safety, mercy over law, love over fear. "Come on," Ruth said, guiding Kiona toward the warmth and light of their home. "Let's see about getting some proper supper into you. Growing girls need more than trail rations and hope." And as they crossed the threshold together, woman, child, and rabbit, Ruth realized that the lonely Apache girl who had knelt on her porch just days ago, begging for shelter, had brought more than a wounded animal seeking healing. She had brought the possibility of redemption, the promise of family, and the reminder that in a harsh world, kindness remained the most powerful force for change. The door closed behind them with a soft click, shutting out the desert night, and enclosing them in warmth that would last long beyond the flickering of any single flame. In the kitchen, Ruth began preparing the first of many meals they would share, while Kiona settled beside Chua and began humming the soft Apache lullabies that had somehow survived even when everything else had been lost. It was, Ruth thought, as she listened to that ancient music fill her home, exactly the way new stories were supposed to begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the expanded homestead as 15-year-old Kiona Callahan adjusted the saddlebags on her horse, preparing for another journey that would take her far from the only real home she had ever known. But unlike that desperate flight through the desert 5 years ago, this departure carried no fear, only purpose, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing she had people who loved her waiting for her return. Ruth watched from the porch, her hair now more silver than brown, but her eyes still sharp, with the intelligence and compassion that had moved her to open her door to a frightened Apache child on that storm-swept night so long ago. In her arms, she cradled a new addition to their unusual household, a 3-month-old abandoned fawn that Kiona had found during her morning rides, another broken creature drawn to the healing sanctuary that their homestead had somehow become. Remember what we discussed about the Hernandez family, Ruth called as Kiona secured her medical supplies and translation books. Maria's youngest has been having those nightmares again, and sometimes children respond better to someone closer to their own age who understands what it's like to lose everything. Kiona nodded seriously, her face showing the careful maturity of someone who had learned to carry adult responsibilities while still young enough to remember what childhood trauma felt like. I'll spend extra time with little Carlos. Sometimes drawing pictures helps children say things they can't put into words. The transformation in both of them over the past 5 years had been remarkable to witness. Ruth had evolved from an isolated widow, protecting herself from further heartbreak, into the unofficial healer and counselor for a growing network of families throughout the territory. Mexican ranchers dealing with Apache raids, white settlers struggling with drought and disease, and Native American refugees seeking safe haven from an increasingly hostile government policy. Kiona had grown from a traumatized child into a young woman who moved seamlessly between worlds, speaking fluent English, Spanish, and Apache, serving as translator, mediator, and bridge builder between communities that had previously viewed each other with suspicion and fear. Her unique perspective as someone who had survived the worst that frontier conflict could offer while finding healing through unexpected kindness made her invaluable in situations where traditional authority figures failed. Mrs. Ruth came, a familiar voice from the direction of the barn, and both women turned to see Sergeant Williams, now simply Tom Williams, retired from military service and working as their part-time ranch hand, approaching with Chua perched contentedly on his shoulder. The rabbit had become something of a legend in his own right, his injured leg having healed so completely that only the slight favor he gave it during cold weather reminded anyone of his near-death experience. More importantly, Chua had proven to be an uncanny judge of character, accepting some visitors immediately while maintaining suspicious distance from others who later proved to be untrustworthy. Tom, Ruth acknowledged with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over years of shared work and mutual respect. How are the new arrivals settling in? Williams gestured toward the expanded barn structure that now served as temporary housing for the steady stream of displaced people who found their way to the Callahan homestead. The Apache family from the Dragoon Mountains is adapting well. The father, Joseph, has impressive skills with metalwork that could prove valuable if he decides to stay permanently. The mother, Sarah, has been helping with the younger children, and their twin boys are already following Kiona around like she's some kind of miraculous older sister. Ruth smiled at this description, remembering how Kiona had initially been terrified of other Apache people, afraid that association with them might somehow endanger Ruth or draw unwanted military attention to their peaceful homestead. It had taken months of patient encouragement before the girl was willing to acknowledge her cultural identity openly, and even longer before she began to see herself as a potential leader and advocate for her people. Any word from Marshall Garrett about the legal status of that family? Kiona asked, checking her saddle girth with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that proper preparation could mean the difference between life and death on the frontier. No, sir. He expects the territorial governor to approve their refugee status within the month, Williams replied. Apparently, the federal government is quietly acknowledging that their previous policies regarding Apache relocation have been less than successful. There's talk of establishing official safe zones for peaceful bands who are willing to integrate with existing communities rather than being confined to reservations. This was news that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago, but the careful documentation that Ruth, Kiona, and their growing network of allies had been collecting, testimonies of military abuses, records of successful integration efforts, evidence of the economic and social benefits that came from cooperation rather than conflict, was finally beginning to influence policy at the highest levels. Kiona's reputation as a translator and cultural mediator had even reached the territorial capital, where she was occasionally called upon to assist with sensitive negotiations between government officials and Apache leaders. At 15, she was already being recognized as one of the most effective advocates for peaceful coexistence in the entire Southwest. "I should be back by Thursday evening," Kiona said, swinging into her saddle with the fluid grace that came from years of constant riding. "The circuit includes 3 families this trip, plus I promised to stop by the mission school in Tucson to speak with some of the Apache children there about maintaining connection to their cultural heritage while adapting to new circumstances." Ruth felt the familiar pang of worry that came with watching Kiona ride away on these increasingly frequent journeys. The girl was no longer the frightened child who had arrived clutching a wounded rabbit, but the world remained dangerous for young Apache women, regardless of their official status or reputation for peacemaking. "Be careful," Ruth said, the words carrying all the maternal concern of 5 years spent watching Kiona grow from daughter to partner to independent young woman. "And remember that your first responsibility is to your own safety. We can't help anyone if you don't make it home." Kiona's smile was warm with affection and understanding. "I learned from the best teacher about balancing courage with common sense. I'll be careful, but I won't let fear keep me from doing work that matters." As horse and rider disappeared into the morning heat shimmer, Ruth found herself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed her isolated grief into this bustling center of healing and hope. The homestead now included not just the original cabin and barn, but additional structures that housed an informal school, a medical clinic, and workshops where traditional Apache crafts were taught alongside practical frontier skills. "She's become everything you hoped she would," Williams observed, settling into the rocking chair that had become his customary spot for morning coffee and conversation. "Strong enough to survive anything, but gentle enough to help others heal from their own wounds. She's become more than I ever dared to hope," Ruth replied, watching Chua hop down from William's shoulder to investigate the fawn she was still holding. "When she first arrived, I thought I was just providing temporary shelter until she could be reunited with surviving family members. I never imagined she would become the center of something so much larger than either of us." The sound of children's laughter drew their attention to the area behind the barn, where a group of youngsters from various backgrounds were playing a complicated game that seemed to combine Apache traditional activities with Mexican folk games and frontier practicality. Watching them interact with the casual ease of siblings, it was sometimes difficult to remember that 5 years ago, such cooperation between different cultural groups would have been nearly impossible. "You know what I think the real miracle is?" William said thoughtfully, lighting his morning pipe as he watched the multiracial group of children. "It's not that Kiona survived what happened to her family, though that was remarkable enough. The real miracle is that she survived it without letting it poison her heart against the possibility of trust and love." Ruth nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She had seen other survivors of frontier violence, both Native American and white, who had been so damaged by their experiences that they became incapable of forming new relationships or believing in the possibility of peaceful coexistence. The fact that Kiona had somehow retained her capacity for compassion, despite witnessing the worst of human nature, was indeed miraculous. "I think," Ruth said slowly, "that part of it came from having Chua to care for during those first terrible weeks after the massacre. When you're responsible for something smaller and more vulnerable than yourself, it forces you to remain connected to the part of yourself that protects rather than destroys." Williams considered this insight while watching the rabbit investigate the fawn with gentle curiosity. Makes sense. And having you believe in her worth when she couldn't believe in it herself probably didn't hurt either. The morning routine continued with the comfortable predictability that Ruth had learned to treasure. Williams tended to the livestock and maintenance projects that kept their expanding operation functional. Ruth worked in her garden, where she grew both traditional frontier vegetables and medicinal plants that Kiona had taught her to cultivate using Apache techniques. The various temporary and permanent residents of their homestead went about their daily activities with the purposeful cooperation of people who understood that their survival and success depended on mutual support. Around midday, a familiar dust cloud on the horizon announced the approach of another visitor. Ruth had learned to read these signs with the same skill that sailors use to interpret weather patterns. The speed and direction of approach, the number of riders, the way they moved across the landscape all provided clues about whether the arrival would bring opportunity, challenge, or simple social contact. This particular dust cloud resolved into Marshal Garrett, now a regular visitor whose official duties increasingly involved coordinating with the informal network of safe houses and mediation centers that had sprung up throughout the territory. His presence usually meant news of policy changes, requests for assistance with difficult cases, or simply the desire for intelligent conversation with people who shared his commitment to justice over expedience. Ruth, Tom, Garrett greeted them as he dismounted, accepting the cup of coffee that had become ritual during his visits. "I bring news that I think you'll find interesting, if not entirely surprising." "Good news or complicated news?" Ruth asked, having learned that in frontier politics those categories often overlapped in confusing ways. "Both," Garrett replied with the slight smile of someone who had learned to find humor in bureaucratic absurdity. "The territorial government has officially recognized your homestead as a model integration community, which comes with a modest but regular federal stipend to support your educational and medical services." Ruth felt a surge of relief at this news. The financial burden of supporting their growing community had been manageable so far, but barely, and the promise of official support would allow them to expand their services without worrying about basic survival. "What's the complicated part?" Williams asked, his military experience having taught him to look for hidden costs in apparently generous offers. "The federal recognition comes with federal oversight," Garrett explained, "which means periodic inspections, detailed record-keeping requirements, and the possibility that Washington bureaucrats, who have never been west of the Mississippi River, will try to impose policies that make no sense for actual frontier conditions." Ruth and Williams exchanged glances, both understanding that official recognition was a double-edged sword that could either legitimize their work or strangle it with inappropriate regulations. But they also knew that operating entirely outside official channels was becoming increasingly difficult as their reputation grew. "There's one more thing," Garrett continued. "The territorial governor specifically requested that Kiona be appointed as an official cultural liaison with a salary and authority to represent Apache interests in government negotiations. It's an unprecedented opportunity for someone her age, but also a significant responsibility." Ruth felt her heart swell with pride at this recognition of Kiona's remarkable abilities, while simultaneously worrying about the additional pressures such an appointment would place on a young woman who was already carrying more responsibility than most adults. "We'll discuss it with her when she returns from her current circuit," Ruth decided. "This kind of decision needs to be hers to make, with full understanding of both the opportunities and the risks involved." As the afternoon wore on, and Marshal Garrett prepared to continue his rounds, Ruth found herself standing once again on the porch where this whole extraordinary journey had begun. The scared child who had knelt in the dust with a wounded rabbit had grown into a confident young woman whose influence extended far beyond the borders of one small homestead. The lonely widow, who had opened her door to unexpected need, had become the heart of a community that proved every day that cooperation was not only possible, but profitable. That evening, as Ruth sat in her rocking chair with the recovering Fawn curled in her lap and Chua drowsing contentedly on the porch rail, she reflected on the truth that had emerged from 5 years of chosen family, hard work, and stubborn faith in the possibility of human decency. Sometimes the most important changes began not with grand gestures or official proclamations, but with simple decisions to treat other people as worthy of care and respect. When Thursday evening arrived and Kiona's familiar silhouette appeared on the horizon, Ruth felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that home was not just a place, but a circle of people committed to each other's welfare. As mother and daughter embraced on the porch where their story had begun, Chua hopping excitedly around their feet in welcome, Ruth understood that the wounded rabbit had indeed brought them more than just the opportunity for healing. He had brought them the chance to discover that love could grow in the most unlikely soil, that families could be created by choice as much as blood, and that sometimes the most broken things, when tended with patience and care, could become the foundation for something beautiful and strong enough to change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.